Very good evening to all of you. And I must say it was a very enormous afternoon, the Feast of Ideas. And it really lived up, right from the astronaut Jerry Rose to all the other speakers. And I must say that this was something everyone at any age can learn and understand new things. And our last speaker is not only will live up to it, I'm sure he has a responsibility to exceed what has happened. He is the leader not only of men, but also of ideas. And I just want to quote John Quincy Adams. He said, if your action inspires others to dream more, to learn more, do more, or become more, you are a leader. We would not have had a better speaker to explore today's discussion on what if every young person were a leader. Now, this is very appropriate when we talk of 120 and 150 and 164 to live. So it is these young people who will build a future. Then we have today Ravi Venkatesan, who is not only outstanding leader, but is also author and also a philanthropist. Currently, he is the UNICEF Special Representative for Young People and Innovation and the founder of Global Alliances for Mass Entrepreneurship, a coalition that aimed to create 10 million local entrepreneurs in India and Africa by 2030. Is a massive, ambitious goal. And what he has an excellent career so far in terms of the leadership. Venkatesan is a former chairman of Bank of Baroda, is a board member and a co-chairman of Infosys. He helped steer the company through a very challenging transition period. He was the chairman of Microsoft India. He helped build India into Microsoft's second largest presence in the world. He has served on the boards of Harvard Business School, AB Volvo, Bunch, Thermex, and he is a trustee of Rockefeller Foundation. Obviously, every great leader passed through the IITs, and also he was obviously a Purdue alumni and an MBA from Harvard Business School, where he was a Becker Scholar. He is also a recipient of Purdue University Distinguished Engineering Alumni Award, and he is author of a book which is well known, Conquering the Chaos, Win in India, Win Everywhere. And this was published by Harvard Business Review. So today we have in Ravi, one of the speakers which Warren Bennett said, leadership is the capacity to translate vision into reality. And that is the subject he would be speaking about today. And it is really a kind of a mature leadership, like a mature wine, which you will hear from him.
Evening. It's going to be difficult to live up to that introduction and to the speakers who preceded me, but with some trepidation, I'll try and at least maybe stimulate you before the end of the session. It's a great honor, a great joy to be here. And in particular, I enjoy following Vijay Chandru, who turns out was my thesis advisor 30 years ago. So The thing I decided to do today, after spending 8 years in Microsoft, I said, I will never use PowerPoint again. I noticed many of the great sort of technology leaders, they don't use much technology. So I'm going to rely on a few notes and avoid killing you by PowerPoint. I'm going to talk a bit about my own work, which is to try and get many millions of young people to be all they can be. And so when Purdue extended this invitation and said, imagine a world, ... I said, can we imagine a world where many, many, many more young people, if not all young people, are operating at their fullest potential? And how do we get there? So let me start by saying, any thinking person, including everyone in this room, we recognize that these are unusual times, and perhaps not the best of times for humanity. Humanity and the planet is going through a pretty tough patch where we are confronted not by one, but by multiple planetary scale problems which really can threaten our prospects, which is one of the reasons why I didn't raise my hand so readily for living longer and longer. So you can think about some of these challenges, right? Climate change, the kind of environmental degradation that's out there, mass extinction, rising conflicts in many parts of the world, extreme inequality, and so on. Those are the challenges. But equally, each of the speakers before us pointed out that this generation, more than any other generation in history, has access to unprecedented technology, the ability to manipulate life itself, to say nothing about materials and bits. We've got unprecedented resources more than any previous generation. So what stops us from tackling these problems? The answer is very simple. It's leadership. For some reason or the other, we don't seem to have the leadership in India or anywhere in the world to effectively tackle these kinds of issues. And I've written about it, and others have written about it. And then gradually I came to the conclusion that perhaps we're looking for leadership in all the wrong places. And historically, and we could even today, we tend to look for leadership for all these issues to people with authority. We look to leaders, political leaders, people who lead institutions, CEOs and business leaders, and so on and so forth. But as Einstein said, that the problems of the world are unlikely to be fixed by the same kind of thinking that created them, and more importantly, what he didn't say is the same people who created them. So maybe this change that we need, the transformation we need, is not going to come from all the usual suspects. Where is it then likely to come? And increasingly, I'm persuaded that we need to turn to young people for these solutions. And the UN system, which worries about these things, they define young people these days as people particularly between the age of 10 and 24, and with some grudging stretching, you can take it to 30. So I certainly don't qualify. Now, why is it that we should believe that we need to turn to young people for the answers to these issues? If you look at advances in every field of human existence, they're disproportionately driven by people below the age of about 32. So you look at the Nobel Prizes or the Fields Medal in Mathematics, you look at the Turing Award winners, a very large percentage of these go to recognize work that was done before they were 32. Okay? They may get the prize at 70 or 50 or whatever, but it recognizes work that was done pretty early. Then I looked at entrepreneurs. Look at all the unicorns, the people who are creating these billion-dollar companies today. They're all remarkably in their 20s, early 30s. And the world's greatest entrepreneurs, John D. Rockefeller, Bill Gates, who else? Jeff Bezos. In India, people like Narayan Murthy. In Africa, Dangote. All these guys, they did it when they were pretty young, usually in their 20s or very early 30s. Then I looked at religious leaders, Jesus Christ, Muhammad, Buddha, Shankara, all these guys. They saw the light, they got the message again before they were 32. revolutionaries, so Lenin, Trotsky, Castro, and then the more peaceful people, Gandhiji, Martin Luther King, and Mandela, again, 20s, early 30s. Same with inventors, James Watt, Steve Jobs. You can go on. All the greatest generals and warriors, Spartacus, Alexander. Alexander was done by the time he was 33. Ashoka, Saladin, young people. And why is this pattern so strong? Well, one was people died much sooner earlier. That was just fact of history, Vijay. But it also turns out that what you need to do extraordinary things, the ability to envision and dream the impossible dream, the drive and ambition to go after it, your ability to think out of the box laterally, risk appetite, all these things diminish with age unless there's some pharmaceutical intervention. But until that is, you can still do a lot at 80, but you can do a lot more of these things when you're younger. And so the good news is, today we'll have the youngest global cohort in history. 1.2 billion people are in that sweet spot between 15 and 24. And if you extend it to 32, it becomes almost twice that number. And in many, many countries, including India, youth represent the majority of the population. So this is what we call the demographic dividend. But this greatest of demographic dividends is being squandered. So if you look at that 1.2 billion, or you take the broader definition, 2.5 billion, a quarter or more are either unemployed or not in school. And not just poor countries and developing countries, but even the rich countries are struggling to create economic opportunities and jobs for this population. And I love what Ambarish talked about in terms of machine learning and new technologies creating 2.5 times the number of jobs historically. But the people who are going to get those jobs are different from the ones who are going to get displaced, okay? And so all these new things are going to create different types of opportunities, and who knows whether they will create as many opportunities. The recent jobs data from India is quite staggering. CMIE, the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, just put out its report in a few days ago. And they said that the total number of people in India who are in the workforce actually declined by 11 million. And in India, as you know, 1 million people turn 18 and enter the workforce age every month. So we need to be creating somewhere between 12 and 20 million new livelihoods, and instead that shrank. And this is not true of India alone, and it's not the fault of the current government. So this is not a political speech. Despite all the interventions, it is becoming a bigger and bigger challenge in many parts of the world. And this is why we see rising levels of disillusionment, of despair, of anger, and violence. And so just at the time when we need to tap into the capabilities, the potential of young people, we're really not doing a great job creating opportunities. So my question now is, what is it going to take to inspire and mobilize millions of people to operate at something resembling their full potential and flourish and show leadership in tackling the many, many problems we face? So I've been devoting the last 2 years to this, and my guru, the intellectual guru, the inspiration for this is a Nobel Prize-winning economist called Ned Phelps. He won the prize in 2006 and teaches at Columbia. And he's written a very difficult to read, but really important book called Mass Flourishing. So he looks at why did Britain and America become prosperous? Why did that industrial revolution? One of those slides that Vijay didn't dwell on is there was a hockey stick in human economic development, which was the first industrial revolution. Why did that happen in Britain and not in neighboring Italy, which arguably at that time was more prosperous? Why did it then move in the 19th century and stay in the 20th century in America? Why is that mantle now appearing to be moving east? So he looks at these questions. And he says this, he says, most innovation and entrepreneurship in America and Britain wasn't driven by a few isolated, iconic visionaries like Henry Ford or Bill Gates. It was driven by millions of people empowered to think of and develop innumerable new products. And the most important thing he says is this: even people with few and modest talents, barely enough to get a job, were allowed the opportunity to use their minds, solve a problem, think of a new way of doing things, or build a new thing. And as more and more pioneering entrepreneurs multiplied, it set off a revolution. And so in this book, he gives a long list of really impressive examples. See, we like to think that these great inventions and entrepreneurship is the preserve of the elite. And we have to get people to a certain level of education before the things can happen. He completely demolishes this and says, ordinary people usually can and do extraordinary things if they're given the right environment. So he talks about what were the great inventions of the Industrial Revolution. The spinning machine, Richard Arkwright. He was the illiterate son of a tailor. Then there was James Watt, steam engine. He was a shipwright, hammering rivets into ships. George Stephenson invented the locomotive, illiterate. John Fitch, steamboat, illiterate farmer. Thomas Edison, the inventor, came from the poorest of circumstances. Isaac Singer, who invented the sewing machine, he was illiterate, and he ran away from school at age 11 to join a traveling circus. John Deere, housing, etc. And then they look at different jobs. They found that more than half of all jobs in the US are at less than 50% of the basic income you need to live a life of dignity. So which means people have to hold on to 2 jobs to just keep things going. It's how are you going to create the environment for creativity and flourishing. So I think we have to find a way, but what you have to do is find pathways. Okay, so you may start out at a subsistence level, but is there a pathway to progress? And there's some thinking about that. Anyway, he used the word wicked problem, that's exactly right. These are deep structural issues. But, I'm a big believer in, for instance, ironically, my first job after Purdue was in the harsh environment of a factory in the Midwest, in Cummins engine making fuel system components. And for whatever reason, mostly I think karma, I got made the 3rd shift supervisor pretty soon. And I used to hate this because they were unionized, they didn't want to work, they were, and there was the joke that time, you never buy anything that was built on a Monday because the workers are in such a bad mood. And I used to hate trade unionism. Yet today, I feel we need to bring back collective bargaining because companies are no longer being fair in terms of giving people a living wage and so on and so forth that they need to flourish. So I think the answers are completely unclear, but we need to have richer dialogue around the contours of the solution. Should we bring back collective bargaining, universal basic income, guaranteed health care, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, we could spend 10 days here easily. Yeah, Rahul.
Very amazing talk, extremely thought-provoking and hit home. I mean, the point on vocational training, most of the training is for jobs that are not going to exist in a few years. It really doesn't make sense. And the number of times I meet young people with great ideas, only to be told that there are 10 other people who kind of discourage them from that, is really frustrating.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm part of organizations like Udyam, which is talking about just developing the entrepreneurial mindset in grade 8 to 10, because those are the formative years of confidence.
Perfect.
What I struggle with is, how do you scale this? I mean, consumer internet is all about scaling. We think about scaling. You're solving this by 2030 for $1 billion. I'm sure you've thought some framework to this. Would love to hear that.
So it turns out that this guy in Udyam, Mekin Maheshwari, is my co-founder of this venture we're at. We've decided to say, can we take on a challenge of getting 10 million young people in India and another 10 million in Africa to stop looking for a job, but actually start something on their own? Is it possible? And the evidence from the guy he's referring to, Mekin Maheshwari, is when you go into even the poorest of government schools, right? And you do some simple things. Say, kids, organize, and in the summer months, we're going to give you 10,000 rupees as a loan. Go launch a business and run it. Whatever business we don't tell them what business. And you have to return the 10,000 at the end. About 9 out of 10 teams actually succeed. Okay, so we know that there are very simple interventions you can do to unleash this entrepreneurial mindset in people. Then we did an experiment with AppTech. AppTech is this training institute. They train 100,000 people to do various things. Coding, beautician treatment, flight attendants, all that. And we said in a few centers, let's just play and introduce entrepreneurial thinking as a mandatory requirement on top of your coursework. 25% of the people in those centers said, we're not going to look for a job. If we fail, we'll come back and look for a job. So I think we're on to something powerful about tapping into that. Now the question you asked is, that's all fine. How do you scale? You can do it in one center with 100 people. How are you going to get 10 million, and how do you get to India scale and Africa scale? I don't know, but my instinct is you cannot do it by conventional means. You can't scale our work. You can't scale organizations to do that. You have to create a movement, okay? So you look at the things that truly succeeded. Civil rights movement. Okay? We don't know about the Me Too movement and how far that'll sustain, etc. But it's a movement. I think we have to learn from that. And that means what we have to do, Rahul, is find young people who show those leadership qualities and get them to become organizers and take 10 more along with them. Okay? Can we unleash it? So right now we're doing very intentional pilots in certain districts, certain towns, and saying, can we actually mobilize a grounds-up movement of young people helping other young people to succeed? I think we have to crack this. I'm sure we will. It may take 2 years. It's a startup problem, okay? So we'll get there.
One last question. I think we have one last one there.
Hi, I'm Snigdha, and I just wanted to ask that since there are so many different leadership styles, there are some authoritarian, some are democratic, I was wondering, as a young person trying to make a big change, do you necessarily have to be an authoritative leader, or can you work around with the other styles?
I think even as an old person, you shouldn't be an authoritarian leader. So, I think the most important thing at any stage is to be yourself. And if you're truly authentic and yourself, you will be a leader, okay? It's only when we try to be something other than who we are that you lose the plot. And then, of course, you're not an inspiring person that anyone else follows. So I'd say just be all that you can be. And that sounds easy. That was the old US Army. But it is actually incredibly hard to do in a society where you get all these contradictory ideas and reinforcement to do exactly the opposite of what your instinct tells you you should do. And I'm writing a book, and this is a plug for the book, which will come out later this year. It's called What the Heck Do I Do With My Life? And my strongest urging is to try and be intentional about that question, to do what you were meant to do. I had a mentor some years ago, and he's repeated what turns out to be a Twain quote. He says, there are only 2 moments that matter in your life. The first is the day you were born, and the second is the day when you figured out why you were born. So, Ravi, your problem is you haven't figured out the second question yet. And I think that's not an event, that's a journey. It's a lifelong quest to figure out, what am I going to do with this life and all the talent and skill that I have? And so as a young person who's at the front end of that exciting journey, I'd say just be on that quest and resist the temptation to be like anyone else.
Thank you.
I'll end it up there, and it was fantastic. And in fact, resonates were where we started. Somebody who knew very early on he wanted to become an astronaut, and he knew that is exactly what he wanted to do. And it goes it from there. So thank you very much. It was amazing as always.
Thank you.